So hey everyone, welcome to today's class. I'm very excited for today because this is a pretty nice architecture, and I just hope you guys stay with me and do not get lost along the way while implementing this architecture. So if you have any doubts or clarifications, we can take it at the end of this session, right? So let's get started. I'm very excited for this. Okay, so we do have the PPT, and you guys are able to see my screen. So what is that icon over there? So what is the whale icon, and what are those over that whale? So it represents a ship, and then over that ship we do have some containers. So we are going to learn about the world of containers today, and we are going to learn about how do we deploy microservices architecture to the AWS cloud by leveraging the concept of containers, right, and containerization. So in order to first understand what containerization is, we have to look at what virtualization is. So let's get started with that. So you can see that virtualization is nothing but you do have your hardware in your traditional architecture. You do have your hardware, and then you have your operating system over which some of your applications are running, right? But when you talk about virtualization and you're in the world of virtualization, so you have your hardware, but that over your hardware, you have a layer called as a virtualization layer that enables you to create virtual machines. So some of this virtualization layer involves installing a hypervisor. It could be the Zen hypervisor that AWS is using, or even they are using the kernel based hypervisor recently, because they are also introducing kernel level virtual machines. There is also one more hypervisor that is used in VMware, which is called as the EXSI hypervisor. So all these hypervisors are nothing but it enables you to create virtual machines in simple sentences and in layman terms. And over those over the virtualization layer, when you run virtual machines, each and every virtual machine encompasses its own operating system and the applications that run over that respective operating system. So since all of these virtual machines, so virtual machine 1, virtual machine 2, and virtual machine 3 over here are all isolated at the hardware level, they really don't know as to what is the other virtual machine that is running alongside it, right? So this is called as hardware level virtualization. And we would have done this long back when we were studying in school, when we installed multiple OSs within our laptop, and right into the boot, we went into either one of the OSs that we have installed, right? So this is virtualization. So why do we need virtualization is because we can save money, obviously. So rather than serving a single purpose machine, we can use it for multiple operating systems, and we can turn it into multiple servers rather than using a single server for a single purpose, right? And we don't need to provision multiple servers. So in that way, you save a lot of cost. And then you save a lot of energy, because virtualization reduces the number of physical servers, therefore reducing energy in order to power them and cool them down and so on. And you also save a lot of time. So with fewer servers, you spend less time on patch management, OS management, and so on, right? And again, you reduce the desktop management headache. So desktop virtualization solutions let you manage that a centralized plane, right? So making it easy to keep it updated and secured. So you get a lot of benefits out of virtualization. So when it comes to a monolith application, an application that is very tightly coupled, and the single unit of scale itself is a virtual machine. So a monolith architecture generally consists of your data interface layer that talks to your database. You do have your business logic, which is written as services in Java or .NET or any other programming language. And then you have your user interface, which is your front-end code, which is written in HTML, CSS, JavaScript, or probably using one of the frameworks in the market right now, like Angular or React and so on, right? So this is how you go ahead and develop a monolith application. But unfortunately, this monolith application is tightly coupled. So there is a single point of failure. So even if there is one exception in one of your classes in your business logic, then automatically your entire application fails, your entire application goes down, and your end users are affected. So there were a lot of problems with monolith applications. So some of the disadvantages that you can see over here is the agility, the speed in which you can develop these components and go to your market as fast as possible was one of the drawbacks, right? Because there were a lot of interdependencies, and you had to use a waterfall model or any other software development lifecycle model in order to develop a monolith application, right? And when it comes to the scalability aspects, the single unit of scale for a monolith application is your virtual machine. So there is an overhead to scaling monolith applications, because we have to create a replica of the same application and then host it on a different server in order to distribute traffic across multiple servers. You can use a load balancer over that. So again, scalability took a lot of time. And when it comes to the DevOps cycle, again, it's pretty big headache, man, because I mean, it fails miserably on this side, because even if there is a small change in your application, the build time increases tremendously, and it definitely decreases the frequency of deployments that goes through production. And I mean, the speed to market is also pretty bad when it comes to monolith architecture. So to overcome this, right, we went ahead and introduced something called as microservices architecture. Not we, but the people in the internet. So I'm not sure who founded microservices architecture, but it's pretty amazing. So when you compare a monolith to a microservice, you could encompass each and every monolith architecture's business logic into its own individual microservice. So you can create one separate microservice for a category service called as a category service, or one microservice that's called as a product service, one that is called as a review service, and so on. And each and every microservice could also have its own independent database, which is also possible according to this diagram. And even your user interface would be running separately, right? So the advantages that it brought out over the monolith architecture was that your microservices application was loosely coupled, and there was no single point of failure. And even if one microservice fails, that respective microservice alone can be troubleshooted, and that separate microservice alone can be scaled if suppose you want scaling. And at the same time, the DevOps cycle also increases fast. You have faster release cycles because you delegate a particular microservice to probably one team to manage, and that team's sole response is to take care of that respective microservice. So you have a lot of benefits over monolith architecture, right? So the microservice architecture, the idea is to split your application into a set of smaller interconnected services that interact over the HTTP protocol or the REST or the RPC protocol, right? And instead of building a single monolith application which is tightly coupled. And some microservices would expose a REST-based endpoint, some would expose a RPC-based endpoint. And the advantage of this was you could use different programming languages to develop different microservices. Come on, you can write one microservice in Java, you can write one microservice in .NET, one in Python, and so on. Anything was possible, right? And you could use one separate microservice to implement the user interface, right? And probably if you're talking from the AWS terms, your user interface, all of your front-end code would be hosted onto an S3 bucket, and in front of it, you would have CloudFront that is sitting, right? The microservice architecture pattern significantly impacts the relationship between the application and the database. So instead of sharing a single database, you could have its own, each and every service could have its own database schema, right? So some of the advantages is that it tackles the problem of complexity by decomposing your big application into a set of manageable services, and it increases your time. Uh, the time to develop these microservices, and also the faster you go to the market. So it enables each service to be developed independently by a separate team. It's very much possible. And microservice architecture enables each microservice to be deployed also independently, which is amazing. On a separate port, it would be running. We have a subsequent slide that describes that. And as a result, the continuous deployment is much faster. You have much lesser build times, and builds for multiple microservices could run in parallel, right? So microservices architecture enables each and every service to be scaled independently, which was one more advantage. So if suppose I would like to scale only the order service alone, I could scale the order service alone of 3 replicas or 4 replicas and put a load balancer in front of it if I'm talking about containers, right? So when it comes to this particular case study, we have the review service, we have the product service, we have the user service, we have the category service, and the order service. So the above application, let's think about it's something along the lines of a e-commerce application, Flipkart or Amazon based application, right? And the above application consists of these following microservices. So let's say during the Black Friday sale, think about these following points. Instead of scaling the entire application as a monolith application, you can scale the individual service alone on a different port, and you can use a load balancer in front of it to serve the increased number of user requests, right? Imagine that each and every service above can have its own database schema, which is amazing. And imagine that each and every service above can have its own build and deploy process defined, its own release cycle defined, or its own DevOps cycle defined, and it could be managed by its own team, right? So there are a lot of advantages, man. So when we spoke about microservice, and when we spoke about its advantages and so on, now comes the question as to how do you deploy microservices, right? So there should be some way that you use to deploy microservices rather than directly taking these microservices and directly deploying them on VMs, which wouldn't give you all of the capability that containerization would. So in the year 2014, we had Docker that came into the market. It's a technology, and it was managed and maintained by Docker Inc. And we have 2 editions regarding that. So we have a community edition, and then we have an enterprise edition, right? So Docker enabled you to do containerization. It was your container engine or your container runtime, right? So how does this work? So you have containers that are running. So you have your infrastructure over which you have your host operating system. So that means, in contrast to virtual machines, containerization is a concept that happens on an OS, right? So you need to have an host operating system like a Windows machine or a Linux machine or a Mac machine in order to go ahead and do containerization. So that means containerization fell under operating system level of virtualization rather than hardware level virtualization, right? So that's something that you have to think. And over your host operating system, once you install Docker and something like that, which is your container runtime, you get the ability to go ahead and spawn your containers. So over your container runtime, you can go ahead and have containers that only has its own respective bins and libraries, and also the application that is going to run over that. And you can have one more container over here and one more container over here, and all of your containers memory and CPU capability is dependent upon the infrastructure that you provision. Because this infrastructure, if it has 8 virtual CPUs and 15 GB of RAM or 16 GB of RAM, the containers that are being spawned are limited to your host infrastructure's capability, right? So that means you need to provision virtual machines, or you could provision bare metal instances, or you could provision dedicated instances on AWS and then install Docker onto it with an operating system, right? Install Docker onto it, and then you could get the ability to create containers, which is amazing. So the comparison between virtualization and containerization over here, you could see the clear difference over here. So you have the infrastructure, you have the hypervisor on the virtualization level, and then over this you have your guest operating system, and then you have your bins and libraries, and then you have your applications that are running over it, right? But when you go with the containerization world, you have your infrastructure, you have your host operating system, which could be Linux or Mac or Windows, and then you have your container engine, which is Docker or Rocket is one more container engine over which you are spawning containers, right? So over here you can see that it's lightweight. The main reason is because it's not bulky like how your virtual machine is, because you have your guest operating system also over there. But here you have eliminated that operating system level to do a virtualization or another level, which is over your operating system. Over here you do it over the infrastructure, but over here you do it over the operating system. So therefore all of your containers are very lightweight in nature, and we will learn more about this in the subsequent slides, right? So your container runtime over here is called as the Docker engine, right? So Docker is a technology that enables you to, create containers. So it has its own ecosystem, which we'll be studying in the subsequent slides. But the components to your Docker engine are, you have the Docker API, which is your REST API, and then you have your Docker CLI, which is your command line interface from where you execute your Docker commands, essentially your terminal window, right? Or your command prompt. And then you have some of the components within your Docker engine, and they are called as orchestration, which is Docker Swarm. You have volumes, you have networking, you have containerd, and then you have distribution. You also have a Docker build kit, and then you have Docker plugins. So if suppose you would like to go ahead and use EBS volumes, or you would like to go ahead and use S3 to store your data storage within your containers, so you can go ahead and use plugins for that. So this is Docker's engine. I'm not going to explain each and every component in detail, but just know that there are components to your Docker engine, and this allows us and enables us to create containers. The main components that I would like you to remember is your Docker API server, which is your REST API server, which is interpreting all of your commands that you're giving through your CLI, right? And then you have a concept called as volumes and networking, which we'll look at a later lecture, right? So Docker engine, it allows the Docker creates a simple tooling and a universal packaging approach that bundles up all of your application dependencies inside a container that run on the Docker engine. And Docker engine enables containerized applications to run anywhere consistently on any infrastructure, solving the dependency hell for developers. So there was a problem before wherein some of the developers would probably complain within your organization stating that it works on my laptop, but then it does not work in production. It does not work in any one of my build environments like staging or QA environment or my UAT environment. So to solve all of these problems, Docker came into play, and Docker was like, instead of going ahead and taking your application and installing it in each and every individual environment, package your application as a Docker image and take that image and run wherever Docker works, right? So if your image works on your local environment and runs successfully on your local environment, take that Docker image and run it on any other environment, which is your production or staging environment or your QA environment, essentially it should have Docker installed, and then you can run your Docker image, right, as a container. So it solves this problem wherein it states that, I mean, it works on my laptop, but it doesn't work anywhere else. So Docker came into the picture and it solved this problem. So Docker is a platform as a service which has OS level virtualization, and containers are isolated from each other using their own respective software libraries and configuration files, which, and through Linux namespaces and control groups, which we are not going to study in detail. But then know like how your virtual machines are isolated from each other on your hardware level. Containers are isolated from each other on its operating system level or the software level, right? So all the containers are run by a single operating system kernel, right? And thus are more lightweight than virtual machines. Right? And Docker is now 6 years old. A container in one single sentence is a lightweight virtual machine. So it's a standard unit of software that packages up your code and all of its dependencies, and the application runs quickly and reliably from one computing environment to another. Right? And how do you run containers is by creating a Docker image. And Docker container image is a lightweight, standalone, executable package of software that also includes your application code. It includes your runtime. It includes your system tools, your system libraries, and your settings. So therefore, you take this Docker image and you run it in any environment. You will be able to run this in any environment as long as Docker is installed in that environment, right? So containers isolate software from its environment and ensures that it uniformly, despite differences, for instances, between staging and development. So this is something that we discussed before. So it works on my laptop, but it doesn't work anywhere else, right? So you can see over here that your container image is immutable, which means that it's a read-only file system. So once you create your Docker image, you will not be able to go ahead and modify that image. So when you run your image within a container, what actually happens is there is a writable layer that is created over your image when it's run on a container, and you are writing only to that writable layer. You're not modifying the underlying image because your underlying image is immutable, which means it cannot be modified, right? And you're always writing to the writable layer once you spawn your image onto a container, right? Cool. So we have a component of Docker called as Docker Hub. It is the world's largest registry, right? A registry is a collection of repositories. A repository is a collection of images, and each and every image has tags associated with it. So let me just open up Docker Hub and show you right now. So it's called as hub.docker.com. And you can go to Docker Hub and you can just search for NGINX. And you can see over here we have the NGINX repository, which consists of a lot of images, right? And each and every image has a tag associated with. So this is the image name, and this is the tag. And you can directly go ahead and pull this image by using the command docker pull, right? We are going to see these commands in the subsequent slide, but this is Docker Hub, which is the world's largest, a Docker registry. And registry is nothing but a collection of repositories. So if I just click on explore over here, you will see a lot of these repositories. And each and every repository contains a lot of images, and each and every image has tags associated with it. Okay? So going back to the slides. So this is the Docker ecosystem. So let me take some time to explain this flow. So you have your remote API or your Docker server that is running, which is your Docker daemon over here. And then you have your CLI through which you specify the Docker commands, right? And then on your Docker server, you have containers running, and you have local images which are downloaded from Docker Hub stored over here. And you have your registry, which is your Docker Hub over here. So let's say, for example, one person goes ahead and specifies the command docker pull nginx. So it's going to look within the, so okay, so let's go from here. So you're going to specify the command over here called as docker pull nginx, right? So it's going to interpret this command. The remote server is going to interpret this command, and it's going to submit this command to your Docker daemon that is running. So your Docker daemon is going to check with its local images whether it already has nginx downloaded. If it doesn't have nginx downloaded, it's going to go and check Docker Hub whether there is an nginx repository over there. And if there is an nginx repository, it goes ahead and takes the latest tag over there. If you haven't specified any tags, it's going to take the latest tag, and it's going to download that image onto your local image. And then it's going to save it over there, right? So that's what happens when you do docker pull nginx. But now let's look at the next command, docker run nginx. So what happens with docker run nginx? So when you instantiate that command docker run nginx over here, your remote API server is going to interpret that command and send it to the Docker daemon. And now the Docker daemon is like, do I have nginx already locally? I do have it because in the previous command only I went ahead and downloaded nginx from Docker Hub. So let me go ahead and take that image and run it as a container, right? So that's how these two commands work, the pull command and the run command. But now let's look at this particular command called as a build command in our lab when we do it, right? Cool. So the easiest way to install Docker is to go ahead and download Docker for desktop. So it's called as Docker Desktop for Windows and Docker Desktop for Mac, right? And the minimum requirements, you should have a 64-bit operating system. You should have a 4 GB of RAM to install Docker and work with it smoothly. And the BIOS level hardware virtualization should be enabled for Windows, right? So you should go to your BIOS and enable virtualization over there, right? So the toughest way to install Docker is to go ahead and create an AWS account, launch a CentOS 7 virtual machine as an EC2 server, and then go ahead and log into the CentOS machine using SSH protocol, and then run these following commands. So you have to do an yum update -y to update your operating system. Install the yum config manager, device mapper, persistent data, and LVM2. That are the prerequisites to installing Docker. And then go ahead and add the Docker repo to your yum config manager to then go ahead and install Docker, right? So you have to go ahead and specify these three commands. And when you go ahead and specify these three commands, automatically Docker is installed. And then you have to specify one command to start Docker, which is systemctl Docker start. You can go ahead and enable Docker by specifying systemctl enable Docker. So it's called a systemctl start Docker and enable Docker, or systemctl Docker start or Docker enable, right? So you can get the hang of it. So you have to start Docker once you have installed Docker, right? So this is the toughest way to do it. I already have Docker for Mac already installed. So you can see my Docker desktop is running over here. So we'll be able to go ahead and do our labs successfully, right? So some of the commands that you have to remember regarding Docker is you can pull an image from Docker Hub using the Docker pull command. You can go ahead and run an image as a container using the Docker run command. You can start a stopped container using the Docker start command. You can stop a running container using the Docker stop command. You can restart a running container using the Docker restart command, which will stop and start it eventually. You can remove a stopped container using the Docker rm command. You can remove an image that you downloaded in your local cache by using the Docker rmi command, which is remove image command. You can list all of the images by using the Docker images or the Docker image ls command, which is ls is to list all files, but generally it's over here, it's list all images, right? And you can do Docker ps to list all the running containers, and Docker ps-a to list all the running containers and the stop containers. So all the containers, right? So these are some of the commands that you have to get accustomed with, right? And you have the Docker build command, which we'll see today to build an image. And we will use the Docker tag command to tag an image appropriately, right? Okay, cool. So let's go to demo. So I hope you have understood as to what containerization is and what Docker enables us to do. So now it allows us to spawn containers. Now you're going to see that in action. So I'm so excited to show this to you. So, but now I'm not opening my terminal. I'm not doing any Docker commands. Why not? Because I'm going to show you as to how, what are the two microservices that I have created. And then I'm going to run these two microservices from my IDE itself. This is Spring Tool Suite IDE where I have written my Java code. So I'm going to run both my microservices from the IDE. And then I'm going to run it from the Docker container. And then I'm going to go ahead and show you as to how to do this on the AWS side of things using the AWS Elastic Container Service, right? So now let's get started. I'll just explain the code in a little bit detail, but then instead of explaining the code, let me just go and show you as to how do I run this and what is the expected output that you see. So I have my student 2 microservice over here, and the student microservice, I have the ID and name of my student. And then in the student repository, I'm just going ahead and selecting all of my students from the database from the table called as student. And then I'm going ahead and listing all of the students over here. But over here, I'm going ahead and listing all of the students based on the ID. So each and every student has an ID, right? So it's ID 1, the name is Akshay. ID 2, the name is Balaji, and so on, right? So I can select star from student where ID is 1. And I can select star from student, which means I'll get the list of all of the students from the table, right? And then I have a controller wherein I have exposed a REST API. So if I go to /student, it's going to list all of the students. If I go to /student/ if I specify the ID of the student, it's going to go ahead and respond back with one student's ID, with one student's details, right? So the way that I run this is I go ahead and run this from my public static void main string args. This is something that you would have studied in college. That's how you run a Java program, right? So let's go ahead and run this. So let's go ahead and run this as a Spring Boot app. And just for you guys to note, in my application.properties file, I have configured my embedded database. And I've also given the server context path to be on /app. You'll see what that is right away. And then I have specified this application should run on the port 9000, right? So let me go to my browser right now. And let me go to the 9000 port. You can see over here, we have localhost :9000. We have app/actuator/health. And this gives us the status as up. But you can see the /app context path that has been appended over here, right? You can go back to the code and you can see over here, the context path that I have appended is /app. So to all of my endpoints, /app will be prefixed. So I can go ahead and show you the student endpoint that lists all the database. So list all the students in the table within the database, right? You can see that ID is 1, we have Akshay, ID is 2, we have Ashray, who is my brother, and ID is 3, who is Aditya, right? This is actually my brother. I have 2 brothers, one elder brother and one twin brother, okay? So now I can go ahead and specify only one ID just by putting / and specifying just 2 over here, which is the second ID, and I'll get only the second person's details, right? So from the table within the database. And if I go to /actuator/health, something that I showed you, you will get the status as up. So this helps us determine whether our application is up or not. So this is the endpoint that we will actually be monitoring from the application load balancer that we are going to spawn up in the AWS cloud side, right? So my second microservice is pretty simple. It does not include this many files. Let me just run my second microservice and show you. So this is called as the teacher microservice. And this teacher microservice has a context path of /teacher, right? So wait for a second until it loads. So you can see over here, it runs on port 10,000 rather than 9,000. And it has a context path of /teacher. So let me just run this guy and show you. So let me go ahead and run this. Run as Spring Boot app. It's going to run it on port 10,000. Remember the previous microservice, the student 2 is running on port 9,000. So once this guy is up and running, you can see over here, we have localhost 10,000 port and the health status is up, right? And we have the context path over here as /teacher. And for this, the context path is /app. So both of these will be helpful for us because we are going to have separate target groups on the load balancer for both of these microservices, right? So since our local testing is done right now, the next question would be, how do you convert this guy into a Docker image, right? So let me just show you that also. But before that, let me just copy one more file. Let me stop these 2 servers that are running. Cool. So let me go ahead and configure. But before that, let me just copy one file, which is my schema.sql file. So I'm just going to go to Finder. I'm just going to copy the schema.sql file. It has all of my queries. So I'm just going to go back and paste this into the student 2 service within the source main resources. I'll just show you this in a second as to what this file is. Sorry. So I'll just refresh this object browser over here. So refresh. Yeah. Okay, cool. So you can see the schema.sql is nothing but it creates my table within the database, right? Creates my student table with ID and name. And then it inserts 3 values into the student table, right? So that's the maximum this guy does. So now let's learn about how do you go ahead and convert this student 2 microservice into a Docker image. You write a Docker file. Since these are Java applications, I'm going to choose to use a base image called as OpenJDK. And where do I get this base image from? I get it from Docker Hub. So let me type OpenJDK over here. And you can see that we have the OpenJDK over here, right? So I'm just going to use the latest version of OpenJDK. And this is called as an instruction. And this is called as a command, right? So the next command that I'm going to do over here is, I'm going to copy the jar file for my Java application, which is my executable file from the target directory. I'm going to copy it into the OPT directory of my container, right? And this next file over here, next command over here specifies that you're going to run that jar file from the OPT directory within the container, and you're going to run it as a background process so that it keeps running, right? This is pretty cool. So now I have my Docker file ready. I have to build using this Docker file in order to get a Docker image, right? But before that, let me first get my jar file. So in my target directory over here, do I have the jar file? I do have a jar file over here. Let me just ensure that I recreate it. I'm just going to do Maven install. I'm using Maven as my build tool over here. So it's gone ahead and, okay, so it's gone ahead and installed my jar file to the target directory. So similarly for teacher, let's go ahead and look at the Docker file over here. It's pretty simple again. So you have the openjdk command over here. And again, from the target directory, you're copying the jar file to the OPT directories, from within the container, right? And then you can see over here, we have the CMD file over here, wherein we have inputted the java-jar file name.jar. But over here, we have the context path again mentioned as /teacher, but then it would override whatever you have mentioned within the application.properties file for the teacher service, right? Yeah, so it's anyways going to override that. And then again, we are running it as a background process by specifying the AND symbol, right? So now let me open up my terminal and let me go to these respective directories and let me get a Docker image out of these microservices, right? Okay, so I have found out my working directory. It's a dp-workspace within which I have student 2 and teacher. So I'm going to go into the teacher first. So let me. So I'm in my teacher microservice, and you can see if you want to build your Docker file, right? So if you want to build your Docker image, you should have the Docker file in the root. Otherwise, you have to use the -f parameter for the Docker command and then specify the path to your Docker file, right? But right now it's in the root of my directory. So I can directly specify the Docker build command over here. Let me just see whether I have some images. So I have only one image over here called as a Bitnami RabbitMQ image. I don't have a teacher image that I created. Let me see if I have any running containers. So you can see over here, we don't have any running containers. So our running containers is empty. And Docker ps-a shows all of the containers that have exited in the stop state or in the running state, right? And let's do the Docker build command right now, and let's see what happens. Yes. So you can see the command over here. So we have specified the Docker build command, and we are tagging it during the build process itself with -t, and we are calling it as teacher. We are calling the image as teacher, and we are specifying dot over here to denote the current working directory, right? And let me go ahead and press enter. So you can see over here, it's sending the build context to the Docker daemon, and it's going ahead and downloading the OpenJDK image from Docker Hub. And this is the first time it's doing that. So that's why it's downloading it from Docker Hub and storing it onto my local cache that we studied about in the Docker ecosystem, right? So let's just wait for a second until this downloads. So this is step 1 of 3. Then the step 2 is to go ahead and copy your jar file from the target directory onto your containers OPT directory. Step 3 is to go ahead and add the metadata to run your jar. Right? Cool. So now it has completed all of the steps. It has completed the step 2 to copy it. And then it has completed the step 3 over here to go ahead and add this instruction to how to run your Java application, right? And now you can see over here, it has finally built it and has tagged it as teacher colon latest. So now let's check Docker images. We should have 3 images. Before we had the Bitnami RabbitMQ, but other than that, we should have 2 more images now. So you can see we have the OpenJDK also, and also the teacher image that we did. So now let me go and do the same steps for the student too, right? Let me go back a directory. So again, in the student 2 directory, you have your Docker file on your root, right? Root of your directory. So let's do the Docker build command again. But this time you'll see it's much faster because OpenJDK has already been downloaded to our local cache. So again, Docker build -t for tagging it. Student2 is the image name, and dot is the current working directory where I have all of my files, including my Docker file. Right? So this time it's much faster because it used the OpenJDK from my local cache itself, and it directly went ahead and copied the the jar file from my target directory to the containers directory, and then it automatically added this instruction, and it finally built the image and it tagged it as student2:latest. Now let's check Docker images. We should have 4 images now. That's cool. We have 4 images over here. We have the student2, we have the teacher, we have OpenJDK, and this is the one that I created long back, right? So just to show you the command to delete an image. So just copy the image name, do Docker RMI, and then put the image name. Okay, so it's already, it's already there reference with the container. So let's remove that container first. So to remove container, you do Docker RM, and then you copy the container ID, and then you hit it. So now the container is removed. So now we can go ahead and remove the image. Beautiful. Cool. So just showing you 2 commands. So now since we have both of our images, we have our student2 and our teacher image. Let's go ahead and run it from the Docker side of things, and let's see if it works. So let me go ahead and run the student2 first. So you can see over here that I'm using the port exposing command, but let me just get to that. So we have the Docker run command over here, and then we have the image, which is the student2, right? But then over here, you can see we are doing port exposing, wherein the container is a separate isolated component, right? So it's a lightweight virtual machine, and this is my laptop within which we have a container that is running. So the container itself has its own networking namespace where it has its own 65,000 ports, and my laptop has 65,000 ports. So therefore, you can see over here from within the container from where my application is running, I'm mapping the port of the container to the port of the host. So the first one is the port of the host, which can be given anything within 1024 to 65,000. But then the port of my container should be the port onto which my application is running. That's when we'll be able to map the port of my application from within the container to the port on the host, right? So let's go ahead and run this command. And in fact, I'm just going to add one more parameter over here to run it in the detached state so that we don't have to see the logs on our console output. Right? So now it's running a container. So let's see Docker PS. Beautiful. It's run a container over here. Let's look at the logs of this container to see whether things are working fine. So you do the Docker logs command, and then you copy the container ID and paste it. So let's put a space over here. Sorry. So you can see over here, it has finally started. You see the logs from within the container. This is beautiful. So let's go and check localhost on our browser, and let's check whether the application has actually come up. Beautiful. The application is up and running. So let's try the student endpoint. Brilliant. So whatever we had in our schema.sql is displayed over here. Excellent. So we have it running from the Docker side of things. Similarly, let's run the teacher. So you can see over here, we have Docker run -p, 10,000 port on the host, mapped to the 10,000 port within the container onto which my teacher application is running. So this is my teacher image, right, that I created. So let's go ahead and run this guy also. You can see this time, you can see the output coming over here. So now it has started. So let's go ahead and look at the teacher microservice. Okay. So localhost 10,000 port with actuator.health is not working. What could be the problem? Let's go ahead and look at our logs. So you can see it's started with the context path of /teacher. It's running on port 10,000 internally, and it's exposed on port 10,000 on the outside. Why am I not able to see that? Okay, let's try this again. Okay, still it's not coming. What could be the problem? Localhost. Okay, we just copy this and paste it in a new tab. Let's see if it works that way. Okay, it still doesn't work. What could be the problem? Let's troubleshoot and see. Okay, So it started on, okay, so it started on port 9000. It didn't start on port 10,000, right? Okay, cool. That's why, because 9000 on our host is already occupied, right? So let me just control C this. Let me go ahead and go to my Spring Tool Suite. Let us do the process of changing this to 10,000, because when we changed it to 10,000, we didn't actually build our jar again. So let us go ahead and do that. So let's do Maven clean. And then let's do Maven install again. And that's Maven install. Let it install the jar again, right? Okay, it's doing the test. Let's wait for a little bit of time. Cool. Yeah, we got the jar. So now let's go ahead and rebuild the teacher service. So we are rebuilding the teacher service to specify that it should run on port 10,000. Okay, so we have rebuilt it. So you can see over here, since we specify the same, image name again, the previous image was tagged as none, right? So now let's run the teacher microservice and see. Okay, so it's running. So let's do Docker PS and let's check. Okay, both of them are running. One is running on port 10,000, one is running on port 9,000, like we specified. So let's just refresh this right now and see. Brilliant. So right now, this guy is working on 10,000 port, the teacher microservice, and on localhost 9,000 port, we have our student microservice running. So this is pretty excellent. So even from the Docker side of things, it's working pretty fine, right? So now let's go ahead and look at the AWS side of things, right? So we are going to use a specific service on AWS called as the Elastic Container Service. So I'm going to do the lab for you. It's pretty much the same configurations that you guys have studied before, and what you have studied today regarding Docker and so on. So let's go ahead and look at the AWS side of things. So I'm logged into the management console, right? And before showing you this, let me also show you the diagram over here. So let me present this diagram. Took some time to get this ready. Yeah. So we have the AWS cloud over here, right? And then you have your AWS region. It's the US East 1 region. And you have a virtual private cloud over there within that. And then over here, you can see we have 4 availability zones within that region. So if you're taking the case of Northern Virginia region, you have 6 availability zones. So we have 4 availability zones that we are choosing. And then you can see over here, we have 4 public subnets mapped to those individual availability zones as a one-to-one mapping. And within which we have EC2 instances that are running, that are part of our cluster, right? Part of our Docker cluster. And then these EC2 instances already have Docker installed within them using a special AMI, which is an Amazon Machine Image, which you have studied before. That AMI already has Docker pre-installed, which is the latest version, which is 19.03. And then we are going to run containers within those virtual machines. We are going to run containers within those virtual machines. And the person who is going to orchestrate all of this and schedule all of this and manage all of this is your Elastic Container Service. So it's going to create an auto-scaling group. It's going to create the VPC network for you and all that. And it's going to launch the EC2 instances for you. It's going to manage Docker on those EC2 instances. And this ECS also has an agent that is going to run within your EC2 instances onto which your Docker containers are running, right? But then how do you register all of the containers that are running within your EC2 instance? How do you expose them to the outside world? You expose them by using a concept called as an application load balancer. So right now we are going to create 2 target groups. One target group that is called as the app target group, and the other target group that is called as a teacher target group. And then we are going to run multiple containers within those virtual machines. We are going to scale them. We are going to terminate some, right? Terminate some containers. But then we will see as to how ECS reacts based on what kind of input we give. And then how all of these containers are being automatically registered to the application load balancer to a specific target group. So I hope you got the hang of this lab, but let's go ahead and set this up, right? Let me just escape from the screen. So right now I'm logged into the AWS management console, right? And let us go ahead and set this up. So let's go to the ECS service. But before going to the ECS service, we are going to create our load balancer for us, right? So let's go to EC2. So you guys should be pretty familiar as to how to create load balancers now. So let's go to load balancers below. Since we are going to do path-based routing, right? We are going to do path-based routing. We are going to go ahead and use an application load balancer. So let me create an application load balancer. Let me give it a name. I'm going to call it as microservices ALB. I'm going to keep it as internet facing. And I'm going to choose my default VPC where I have 6 availability zones, which I'm going to choose. The listener on my load balancer is going to be HTTP port 80. I'm going to leave this warning, which is saying that I'm not using HTTPS and so on, but it's okay for right now. I'm going to give the security group of my load balancer. I'm going to create a new one. I'm going to call it as microservices ALBSG, and I'm going to open up port 80 to the outside world. I'm going to just create one default target group because we have to create the load balancer. I'm just going to create one default target group. But then we are not going to register anything to the default target group, right? I'm just going to leave all of these settings as the same. I'm not going to register any targets because I don't have any ECS instances that are running right now. I'm not going to register any targets. I'm just directly going to click on review and click on create. Yep. Cool. So one load balancer has been created, one application load balancer, and it's in the provisioning status. It will automatically go to the active status in 2 to 3 minutes. In the meantime, let me also show you one alternate to using Docker Hub, which is called as Elastic Container Registry. So let me type ECS, Elastic Container Service. So just like how Docker Hub is a registry, you also have ECR, which is Elastic Container Registry, which is again a collection of repositories, which is again a collection of images, which has tags associated with it. So we don't have any repositories created over here. I'm going to create 2 repositories, one for student, one for teacher. So I'm going to create one for student, and I'm going to create one more for teacher. So ECR also has another feature which is called as scanning your Docker images for vulnerabilities. It is using the ClarOS project in the background, right? So it was a recent addition to ECR as one of the configurations to automatically scan your images on push, or you could also probably scan it as a manual scan whenever you want, right? So right now we have 2 repositories that are created over here. We need to upload our images from our local laptop to these repositories, right? So to do that, I have to configure IAM credentials for myself to go ahead and use the Docker push command and the Docker login command to go ahead and push my images to this to these repositories from my local laptop. So let me go to IAM and let me create some admin credentials that I can use. Probably I'll use Aishwarya as user. So she has administrator access. Let me create a pair of credentials for myself. I'm going to specify the AWS configure command to specify my credentials. I'm going to copy the access key. Leave the region as US East 1 because that's where my ECR registries are and where my cluster is. The output format is JSON. So since we have configured our CLI right now, the next step that we have to do is appropriately do a tag. But then I'm not going to memorize all of these steps. I'm going to follow what ECR gives me. So for the student microservice, I'm just going to click on the student microservice over here, and I'm going to click on view push commands. So you can see over here, it tells you to run this first command to log into the ECR service. And then you can go ahead and build your student microservice, which you already have built. And you're going to tag it appropriately and then push it, right? So we're just going to copy this to login first. Okay, so it's giving you some commands over here as help, right? So it's telling you cannot perform the interactive login from a non-TTY device. Okay, so let's do this command once more. Let's do only this part of the command first. Okay, it's still not working. So invalid choice. Or let's probably do this command and let's see what happens. Okay, so it's stuck on the screen. sure why it's not working. Okay, let's see if we are able to log in using some other command. So it's telling you to retrieve the authentication token using this. So it's asking us to, if you're receiving this error, make sure you have the latest version of AWS CLI and Docker installed. Maybe that's because that's the reason why I'm getting this error. So let's try this one more time. I'm not sure why it didn't work the previous time. Let me just clear the screen and try it again. Okay. So maybe I'm not using the latest AWS CLI. Yep. So it's using the get login command. Yeah, so I don't, so there is the get login command over here. What could be the problem? Sorry. Click on view push commands. So it's get login password command. Yeah, so I do not have the get login password command. Yeah, I have only the get login command. So let me check some of the AWS documentation, right? To just surpass this to see if there is any other, way to go ahead and log into ECR. Right? Cool. So this is the previous version that I was using. So let me go ahead and do this. Yes, we have automatically logged into ECR. So what we have to do right now is you have to just copy this Docker login command with the password. Yes. So login is succeeded. Brilliant. Okay. So now what I can directly do is I can tag my image appropriately to ECR. So let me just go ahead and get that command from ECR. So the login is done right now. So let me just tag it accordingly. So let me go ahead and click on this one. Yes. So what this one does is it goes ahead and tags your image that you have locally, which is student2, I believe. So it goes ahead and tags it accordingly. So this is my image. I have called it as student2. It automatically tags it accordingly. So let's do Docker images right now. So you can see over here, it has automatically tagged the student2 image as this particular image, right? Image. Let's go ahead and copy this and let's do a Docker push. Oops, sorry, Docker push with the endpoint. So now it will automatically go ahead and push this image from your local system to ECR. The similar steps has to be followed for the teacher image. So let's do the same for the teacher image. So let's go ahead and get the commands for teacher, and specifically only the tag command. Right? Let's wait for this to push and finish. So my upload speed is pretty good today. Cool, the image is pushed to Docker Hub. So let's do the same for the teacher image. We have tagged it right now. Let's do Docker images. Cool, we have tagged it over here. So let's just copy this guy and let's do Docker push. And let's also push the teacher image. So you can see in ECR right now, when you go to the student repository, you have one image over here that you have pushed right now, right? So this is the image that we are going to use within our container in ECS to go ahead and spawn the container and run this application over there, right? So similarly for teacher, once that image has been uploaded, it's going to be showing over here. In the meantime that it uploads in the background, let's get our ECS cluster set up. So let's go to ECS and let's click on clusters. So I believe I don't have any clusters running. So let's go ahead and click on create cluster. So now they are giving you three options over here. And the option that we are more interested in looking at is the EC2 Linux with networking. But the difference between powered by AWS Fargate and using EC2 is that the only difference between Fargate and EC2 is that with EC2, you actually have your EC2 instances running, and you're able to see which EC2 instances are running, and then you are able to manage them as you would manage an EC2 instance, right? But when it comes to Fargate capability of AWS, they in fact manage the EC2 instances in the background. They manage the virtual machines onto which your application is being hosted. All you need to provide is the memory that is needed for your application to run, and the CPU that is required for your application to run, the memory and the CPU, right? So the entire infrastructure is being taken care of by AWS. So this is part of the serverless offering. But EC2 Linux with networking is what we are going to do today, because we are going to spawn one EC2 instance that has Docker pre-installed with it using a Linux-based AMI, right? And we are going to specify our VPC and subnets too. So let's choose the EC2 with Linux. So the cluster name that I'm going to give is microservices cluster. I'm going to use Spot instances over here. Sorry, I'm going to use on-demand instances, but I could also go ahead and use Spot instances. The on-demand instance that I'm going to use is M580 large. It has 2 virtual CPUs and 8 GB of RAM, right? I'm going to go with one EC2 instance. And the AMI ID that I'm going to use over here already has Docker pre-installed within it. I'm not going to change that. It also has the ECS agent and Docker pre-installed, which is the 19.03 version. I'll show you that once this cluster is created. And the volume size that I'm going to give should be greater than 22 GB. So I'm just going to give 30 GB for right now. And the keypad that I'm going to choose is my keypad, so that if at all I want to troubleshoot this EC2 instance and go ahead and look at some of the logs, I'll be able to do that. The VPC that I'm going to place this in is the same VPC that I chose for my application load balancer that I created before. So I'm going to choose my default VPC. So this is my default VPC. I'm going to choose all the subnets, all the 6 subnets, because I chose all the 6 subnets mapped to the availability zones when I chose the load balancer, right? So I'm going to choose all the 6. So there's one more I have to choose, I believe. Yep. Okay. So I'm going to create a security group, a new security group for this ECS cluster, and that too for this EC2 instance. And then you can see it needs an IAM role because it's managing all of your EC2 instances, even the auto scaling group, including creation of the VPC. If suppose you choose to create a new VPC on your behalf, so therefore you need an IAM role for that. And let's go ahead and click on create. So it's going to create the ECS cluster, and it's going to use the CloudFormation stack, which we studied previously, to go ahead and create your auto scaling group and your launch configuration. So this will take a little bit of time, probably 2 to 3 minutes. So let's wait for 2 to 3 minutes until our cluster is up and running. So this cluster is going to have one EC2 instance that has Docker pre-installed, and onto which our containers are going to be run, right? So cluster is one of the configurations that we studied right now. So let's go ahead and view our cluster. So you can see over here, the ECS instances. We don't have any results over here. So let's go to EC2 and check whether one instance was launched or not. I just hope I have my service limits and count so that I'm able to get one EC2 instance. Do I have one? Yep. So there is one EC2 instance of the M580 large capability that is coming to the running status. So let me just refresh this in ECS to see that EC2 instance over here. Cool. It's running and it's showing over here. It has 2 virtual CPUs. It has 8 gigs of RAM. It has the ECS agent, the latest agent that is running. And it has Docker 19.03 version that is also running over here. So just. So yeah. So I have one EC2 instance that is running over here right now. So the other things that you could see over here, you can see tasks and you can see services. So I'll explain in more depth as to what this is. So once this cluster is up and running, right? So we can go ahead and create a task definition for us, which is very similar to a Docker configuration, right? So whatever you mentioned within a Docker configuration, like you want a container to be running and you want that container to have this much resource limits, like this much RAM and CPU. And then you want that container to to send out all of its logs to CloudWatch, wherein you can see all of the logs using the AWS logs driver and so on. So let's go ahead and create the task definition and listen to only the important configurations that we are doing over here. And obviously, since we chose the compatibility type to be of Linux plus EC2 instances, we are not going to go with Fargate. We are going to go with EC2. I'm going to give the task definition a name. So this is a low level configuration. I'm going to call this as the student task. And you can see over here, the network mode is bridge by default. You also have the host networking mode and the non-networking mode. But where do these networking modes come from? You do Docker network ls. You see that we already have the bridge and the host and the non-networking mode, right? So this is nothing but Docker networking that you choose over here. But there is also one more networking mode called as AWS VPC, and that is supported only for the Fargate capability, right? The default chooses the bridge networking mode of Docker. So I will let you guys study more about the bridge networking mode. So over here, you're going to add a container definition. So you're going to give the container a name. The container image is going to come from ECR. So let's go to ECR. So this container image can also come from Docker Hub. So it automatically downloads from Docker Hub also. So I'm going to choose the student image over here, this URI, and I'm going to paste it over here. And I'm going to specify the latest to take in only the latest tag. The way you specify a Docker tag is by separating the image URI with the colon. Right? And then memory limits I'm going to choose is the soft limit I'm going to go with 1024. And the hard limit I'm going to go with 1512. So which means that I give it 1 GB of RAM to run. But if it consumes more than 1 GB, it can go maximum up to 1.5 GB of RAM. And this is where you do the port mappings. That's the reason why I showed you the -p parameter, which is the port mapping parameter, when you ran a Docker container to view it on the host, right? So for the student image, it's running internally on 9000, but the host, this time I'm going to leave it as 0. This is called as dynamic port mapping. Very, very important, because when you leave the host port as 0, it goes ahead and spawns a container with a dynamic port mapping, wherein it randomly maps a port from the range of 32,000 to 33,000 and so on, right? So to just see this on action in your local terminal when you ran it. So you can see over here, we have the Docker run -d-p 9000 and student 2, right? But we haven't specified this colon and mapped it to any port on the host. So let's see what happens right now. So you can see over here, these are the two containers that we launched before, but then this particular container alone, we never mentioned the port mapping over here. So it automatically assigned a random port on 32,768 from the range of 32,000 to 33,000. Did I mention this? No, I didn't. So that's the reason why you have to understand dynamic port mapping is when it comes to the containers, it's very helpful. When it comes to the load balancer, it's also very helpful because it automatically spawns the container and then maps it to a dynamic port at runtime on your EC2 instance, or in that particular use case on my laptop, right? So I'm going to leave the host port to be 0 for dynamic port mapping. So I'm going to come down over here and just do the logging configuration alone. So I'm going to go ahead and use CloudWatch logs to see all of my logs. I'm just going to click on this and enable it. But if you are familiar with other logging drivers like Splunk or Sumo Logic and so on, you can go ahead and configure that respective logging driver also. But right now I'm going to go with CloudWatch logs. I'm just going to go ahead and add this container definition over here and scroll down and click on create for the task definition. So great, we have one task definition created. Let's do the same for the teacher microservice, right? Let's create a new task definition, EC2 type capability. Let's click on next. Let's call this as the teacher task. And I'm not going to choose anything over here. I'm just going to scroll down and add a container definition. I'm just going to call this as teacher container. I'm going to copy the teacher, image URI from ECR, and I'm going to paste it over here. So similarly, I'm going to specify a soft limit over here as 1024 and the hard limit to be 1512. And similarly over here, I'm going to specify the host port to be 0, but the container port within which my application is running, that container port is 10,000 on which my teacher service is running. So let me scroll down and just configure my CloudWatch logs where I can see my logs. Let me scroll down and click on add. Let me scroll down and click on create. So we have two task definitions created right now, but then how am I going to use these task definitions to create my containers, right? So how am I going to run my containers? So that's where another concept of ECS that comes into play is called as service. And using this service configuration, you will be able to do a hell of a lot of things. I'm just going to show you all of its capabilities right now. So we are going to go to this cluster, which is currently running with that one EC2 instance, which already has Docker installed and so on. We are going to go ahead and leverage service, which allows us to do that scheduling and that orchestration capability. So I'm going to go ahead and create the service. So similarly, like how we chose the EC2 to be of, the cluster to be of EC2 type, and the task definition to also be of the EC2 type. Even your service is going to be of type EC2. I'm going to choose the service, the task definition to be student task. And I'm going to go ahead and choose the same cluster. The service name to be called as student service. And you can see over here, the service type to be of replica or daemon. So you can click on this information box to find out as to what they mean. So replica means how many replicas do you like to run within your cluster. Daemon is something that runs on all of the nodes within your cluster. So if you have some monitoring application like Prometheus or something that is running, and you have one component of Prometheus called as a node exporter, which collects metrics from all of the nodes that are running within your cluster, probably that node exporter image alone, you want to run it as a container on all of your nodes, right? And even when you add a new node to your cluster, automatically the node exporter component should be running. So in that particular use case, you would go with daemon. But right now we are going to go with replica, wherein we are going to mention the number of replicas. We would like 2 containers that should be running, which is my desired capacity. Then I'm going to scroll down and I'm going to ensure that it's balance spread, but then ultimately I have only one EC2 instance. Right now this wouldn't matter. I'm just going to skip explaining that. So right now you can see over here, we are not going to enable Route 53 discovery over here for DNS, but we are going to enable our application load balancer that we created. So you're going to go ahead and click on application load balancer. And you can see over here, it has automatically detected the microservices ALB. And we are going to add that container port of 9000 to the load balancer. And we are going to map it to the port 80 of the load balancer. And then for the target group, which we are going to create it from here, I'm just going to call it as the student service target group. And the path pattern is going to be /app and star, because the student service has the context path of /app. This is something that you have to remember, because when we spoke about it and when I showed you, so you can see over here, since my containers are still running, you can see it's 9000 /app/student. So that's how your context path is there. So that's the same context path that you have to give over here. The evaluation order is 1 because you already have a target group with evaluation order as 0, which is your default target group that you created when you created your application load balancer. So you have to specify your context path that you're using over here. And then you have to specify your health check path. So I'm going to specify the health check path to be it's going to be /app/actuator/health. I'm just going to copy this and check it over here whether it works. Cool, I get a status as up. So the health check path is going to be this. So let me just go down and let me click on next step. So you can do service auto scaling over here. So you already learned about auto scaling for EC2 instances based on CPU utilization and so on. You would like to scale your EC2 instance. If suppose the CPU utilization is greater than 70%, you would like to add one more EC2 instance. If the CPU utilization is less than 20%, you would like to remove one EC2 instance and so on. But over here, this is container level scaling, man. This is service level scaling, which is amazing. So based on the metrics of your container, like the CPU utilization of your container, you can choose to spawn one more container on the fly. And this happens within your cluster, right? But we are not going to adjust this right now. But just remember, rather than the auto scaling that you had for your EC2 instance, you also have auto scaling for your container, right? So based on your container metric, whether if your CPU utilization of your container runs greater than 70%, I'm going to add one more container to my cluster, right? To load balance and also to balance the load, right? And so the traffic to your end users. So I'm not going to adjust the load, but you can see over here, you can do service auto scaling by specifying the min and max, the number of containers. And then you can see you can do target tracking or step scaling that you saw before. And you can see the average CPU utilization over here. And if the target value is greater than 70, I'm going to add one more EC2 instance, sorry, one more container. And if the CPU utilization is less than 20%, I'm going to remove one container. So all of that is being taken care of by the service auto scaling. You can also do step scaling, wherein you mention the increase count and the decrease count by yourself, right? But I'm just going to disable this for right now. I'm going to click on next. I'm going to go ahead and click on create service. I'm just going to wait for a little bit of time, and we are going to see the magic happen over here. So we have all been working hard for the last 1 hour just to see this result, right? So your service is created. Now let's go ahead and see if I have some tasks automatically created for me. Cool. I have 2 tasks or 2 containers that are running. These are in the pending status right now, and it will go to the running state. They are still in the pending state. Just wait for a little bit of time. Okay. Cool. Now they are in the running state. Now both of them are in the running state, and both of them are running. Let me go ahead and look at the logs over here. The logs are starting to come, and cool. So it has been initialized. It's great. So let me go to the details over here. Let me expand this container, and you can see, since we specified the host port to be 0, it has dynamically mapped this port over here, which is 32.769. And now the catch is, the most difficult part over here is to check whether your EC2 instance is load balancer, right? Whether it's registered these containers. So let's go to EC2. There's one small modification that you have to do on the security group of the EC2 instance. So let me just do that right now. So there is the security group of this EC2 instance. I'm going to specify that all the traffic to this EC2 instance can come from the load balancer security group. So I'm going to choose all traffic to come from the load balancer security group. So I'm going to do SG hyphen, and let me just take my security group of the load balancer. So what did I call it? I think I did my. So I think I called it as my microservices, right? So is there my microservices anywhere? No, it's not there. Let me go ahead and get the security group of my load balancer from below. I'm not sure what I called it as. So it's called as microservices ALB. So let me just copy this security group ID. Let me go to the EC2 instances security group. And let me open up all ports to come only from the load balancer security group. All traffic to come only from the load balancer security group. Cool. Let's click on save. Now let's go to our load balancers target group, and let's see if our containers have come to the healthy status for the student service target group. Let's click on targets. So both are in unhealthy status. Let's just wait for some time. Both the containers are in the unhealthy status. So the advantage to doing this is, now if the ECS service finds out that your containers are in the unhealthy status, it automatically spawns new containers for you. It deletes the previous ones and spawns new ones for you. So you can see these 2 are running right now. So it's still not spawned any new ones. Let me just refresh and see. It's still in unhealthy status. So let's just check the health check right now. So it has to pass 5 healthy thresholds of timeout 5 seconds, and the interval is 30 seconds. So we have to approximately wait for at least 150 seconds before we find out that our targets are healthy, right? And it's app/actuator/health, which we already tested over here, which should be working fine. So let me just wait on this target group's target. So right now it's in the draining status because it found out that these are unhealthy. So let us wait for some more time before the ECS service spawns 2 more containers over here. And in the meantime, let's go ahead and create a service for the teacher microservice, right? So we have only one service that we have created for the student microservice. Let's create one for the teacher microservice. So this is also of type EC2. We are going to use the teacher task definition. We are going to go ahead and call this service as teacher service. I'm going to go with 2 tasks again over here of type replica. And I'm going to choose to receive traffic from 1 or more load balancers. And I'm going to add this load balancer port. I'm going to map it to port 80. And the target group name, I'm going to give it as the teacher service target group. And you can see for the teacher service target group alone, the path pattern starts with /teacher. So let's go to localhost 10,000. The path starts with /teacher, right? So, and we are going to give this the evaluation order of 2 because we already have the student service target group with the evaluation order of 1 and our default target group. So health check path is going to be /teacher/actuator/health. And then we are going to go down and we are going to click on next step. And we are going to not scale for the service auto scaling. Click on next step and let's go ahead and create this service also. So let's wait for a second until this is created. So it should create a new target group for the load balancer. It should automatically create 2 containers right now for the teacher service. So let's check whether it has created 2 tasks. Yep, there are 2 tasks or 2 containers that it has created. And let's check whether we got 2 new containers that are running for the student. Yep, 2 new containers are running. Let's go ahead and look at the target group. Let's refresh this. Cool, we have 2 containers for the student service, which have come to the healthy status, which is great. And now we are also going to look at the teacher service target group, which has also come to the healthy status. This is brilliant. So now is a fun factor wherein we go to the description, to the load balancer's description, copy the DNS name of the load balancer, put it on the browser. Let's do /app/student. Bingo, we get the student service. This is path-based routing. It's a great functionality. Let's do /teacher. This is on the load balancer's DNS name. So even the teacher service target group is automatically, picking up the containers and it's working great, right? So you can do path-based routing based on that respective path that you do. 2 different microservices that are registered to 2 different target groups, right? So let me just show you that rule on the load balancer that has been created. So on the listeners, you can see on the port 80 listener, when you click on view or edit rules. So you have 2 rules over here that has been specified automatically from the ECS side. So we have /app going to the student service target group, /teacher going to the teacher service target group. And this is great. This is a great functionality. So now what happens if I go ahead and manually delete one container? Let me just remove these 2 tasks or let me just remove one container over here. Let me click on stop and stop. So this is what ECS also does for you. This is called as orchestration. And it also maintains the desired capacity that you mentioned at the start. The desired capacity for a student service that you mentioned was 2, right? And you deleted 1, which means the desired capacity has to always be maintained. So let us see what happens if we just refresh. Okay, it's taking a little bit of time. Just give it some time. And you should see the magic happen wherein you have 1 more container that is being running for the student service. Just wait for a little bit of time. Cool, we got 1 more right now for the student service that is running. So at all points of time, ECS always tries to maintain the desired capacity for your service that you have specified. And the desired capacity that we specified for both the student and the teacher is 2 and 2. But what happens if I remove all? It is automatically going to spawn 4 more containers for me, right? But what happens if I choose to update the service and scale? If I choose this service and if I choose to update it to 3, and I'm going to force a new deployment, I'm going to go ahead and click on next and click on next, click on next and click on update. So now it's going to spawn 1 more for me. When I go back to the tasks, you can see over here under the microservices cluster, let's look at all of the tasks. So you can see that we have 4 running, but we are going to see 1 more running next because we have updated the desired capacity for the student service to be 3. Right? Let's see if we have enough capacity on the ECS instance. So now the available memory that we have over here is, the available memory is only 556. Oh my God. So maybe we will not have that container running. Let's see under services, under tasks. Oh, we have things running right now. Cool. So we have 3 that are running. So we have 5 probably for the student service right now. And the previous 2 will be removed because we should always maintain the desired capacity. So right now the desired capacity is 3, but then the capacity that is running right now is 5, right? So it's going to automatically terminate 2 running containers to always maintain the desired capacity of 3, right? So we'll just wait for some more time. It's going to remove 2 containers, but I don't have that kind of patience. What I'm also going to show you right now is how do you create your own domain name and register this load balancer's domain name to a user-friendly domain name like api.myapplication.com, right? So let me go ahead and log into another AWS account that I have. in an incognito window. So let me log into another account where I have my domain name registered. So I purchased this domain name today for doing the Route 53 labs. So let me go ahead and go to Route 53, which is the DNS service. Let me go ahead and copy this domain name from the load balancer, the load balancer's DNS name from the description, right? Let me just copy this guy. And in Route 53, I'm going to go to the hosted zones, to my hosted zone. And I'm going to create a record set. And I'm going to call this as API, probably just api.zerosinitiative.com. And I'm going to choose CNAME record. And I'm going to set the TTL to be 60 seconds. I'm going to paste the load balancer's DNS name over here. And I'm going to use a simple routing policy over here. Just go ahead and click on create. Right. So now if I go ahead and copy api.zerosinitiative.com, this is a DNS name that I can remember easily. Let me just paste this over here. And let me do /. This is great right now. So you can see the JSON that was, I mean, I don't have readability over here, but then you can see the output is coming over here. We have just translated a custom domain name that we have bought to the load balancer's domain name, in front of which you have an ECS cluster, within which you have EC2 instances that have Docker installed. On those EC2 instances, you have containers that are running. That's the architecture that we have implemented today. It's pretty amazing, right? So let's go back to the diagram and let me just do a small recap. So in the AWS cloud, in the region of US East 1, you have a virtual private cloud, which is your default VPC, within which you are leveraging all of the availability zones, which you have mapped to public subnets, within which you have EC2 instances. On those EC2 instances, you have Docker installed. And on those EC2 instances, or inside those EC2 instances, you have containers that are running. And all of this is being managed by ECS, which is Elastic Container Service. And even if you delete one container, it's going to spawn one for you. It's always going to try to maintain the desired capacity for you. It's going to scale for you. And then all of this is being registered to the application load balancer, on which we have two target groups for two individual microservices that we have created, which is the student microservice and the teacher microservice. And where are these images lying? These Docker images are being stored in Elastic Container Registry, wherein we have created two repositories and within which we have uploaded our images. That's how beautiful this architecture is, right? So this is an industry use case. It's highly available. The same you could probably replicate and create for high availability across regions. But right now we have worked within a region and we have created a highly available architecture within a region. And obviously you should have more than one EC2 instance running. But for demo purposes, we have only one EC2 instance that is part of our cluster, right? So the way you terminate this environment, you first go ahead and delete your load balancer. Probably you delete your cluster, but before that you delete your load balancer. So we are going to go ahead and delete this load balancer. And let's go ahead and delete our target groups. Okay, so next thing is you would go ahead and delete your cluster. So you have to put in the phrase delete me, and then it's going to go ahead and delete your cluster. It's going to take some time to delete all of your tasks, all of your services, and then go ahead and delete your cluster. So thanks a lot for attending this session. I know it was a lot to take in, but this is a really good use case for microservices deployment onto the AWS cloud by leveraging ECS. And we also saw a custom domain name that we purchased and registered and translated our load balancers domain name onto. So for backend services, you can have API. For databases, you can have DB dot. And for frontend, you can have your website dot, right? So thanks a lot. Have a nice day. Hope you try to recreate this architecture. Have a great day. Bye-bye.